Blessings, family, and welcome to another edition of What is the Time, a podcast about personal sovereignty, celestial timing, and living where the getting is good. Thank you so much for being here another time. I super appreciate all y'all for being here, and I super appreciate my friends Pallas and Cameron for coming back another time. We're about to talk about the quarter ahead. We're going to make a little astrology forecast for you to enjoy and for you to plan your life however you like. You can panic, you can make better choices, however you like to do it. If you want to support the production of this kind of content, if you want to support on Patreon, I think each of us has a Patreon. We each have sites and astrology readings available. We can do all of these kinds of things. You can check out the music. I do music. You can find it on Spotify, Tidal, Pandora. You can send me a tip via Venmo, Cash App, PayPal. You can do all of these kinds of things. There are a lot of ways that I always forget to plug as well. You can find it all on ZamboniFunk.com. Thank you so much for being here. And I want to send a quick shout out to Pallas and Cameron. What's up, y'all?
Yo, what's up?
It's a different world almost.
It sure is, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
It's a brave new world out here. So, Pallas, you want to bring us in? What's the new world about? What makes you say that?
Well, I forgot that Saturn was my time lord until Saturn moved into Pisces. And I was like, why is this so loud? I was like, oh, right. I'd just been conveniently ignoring the fact that Saturn was my time lord until the move into Pisces. And there's movement, and that's complicated because, and I mean, the energetics of it is like, we've been so rigid for so long. And suddenly there's this kind of shiftiness underneath. And it feels like it's so low down at this point, and it's just kind of like, it's like the quake is just like kind of rising. And so I'm feeling that really low hum just get louder, and movement happening that's coming from like really deep underneath. And I feel like we haven't really felt it yet quite up here. And yeah, there's a lot coming this quarter, and the mess is real.
For sure.
And I'm into it. Yeah, I'm here for it.
Word. It's worth mentioning that Saturn just moved into Pisces about 3 days ago. So we're recording this on Friday, March 10th. And so Saturn in Pisces is brand new for us. Saturn is going to be there in Pisces for like 3 years or something. And so we've got plenty of time to look into this whole Saturn in Pisces moment. Some real major things are changing here. You know, about 3 years ago when Saturn moved into Aquarius, that was a really big deal as well, because when Saturn moved into Aquarius, then at the very same moment we had a conjunction with Jupiter, who was also there at 0 degrees of Aquarius. And so that was called the Great Conjunction. And it was the first time we had a great conjunction that is going to be followed by other great conjunctions in air signs for 200 years. So before that, we had been having great conjunctions in earth signs. And now we are moving into this period of great conjunctions between Saturn and Jupiter in air signs. And so this marks a 200-year period of change in the way that we think about reality. What are we even looking at, and how do we exist in the world, and what gets to be real, what gets to be considered real in this era? And so the very first thing that we saw there was that conjunction between those two. And then we just continued doing a bunch of Saturn stuff. Saturn has been in deeply impressive dignity for a long time, ruling all the planets in the sky, and just doing the Saturn things as much as Saturn really wants to. But now, as we've got Saturn moving into Pisces, then we're not doing all Saturn everything anymore. Saturn is now ruled by Jupiter, and we are going to see some other things taking place in this time. So Cameron, I know you've got like strong, like mutable Saturn energy. So will you tell me a little bit about what you're feeling on that?
Yeah, one thing I've been thinking about a lot lately is just like a kind of like a change in faith kind of energy. And so like like that's something that like holds the structure of like people's lives, and like that is kind of like waxing and waning a little bit. Even just like the general theme of things I've seen, like people in more in like the local environment, kind of like shifting away from their like new agey kind of ideas of spirituality. Like some people going back to like Christianity, or some people moving away from Christianity even more again. And so something about that has been really loud. And even for me, like I went on ahead and just injected myself with it, and I like got a Quran, and then I just like other like Zoroastrianism. I started like getting into that. So just like I'm just like injecting myself with that, and I'm also seeing it kind of happening just like in the general field of where I live in Memphis, Tennessee, which is the Bible Belt. So I get to see it louder here than in other places. So that's one thing. And then another thing to me too is just like the rigidity that people have had around their ideas and what they think life is, and how that's moving and shifting from deep underneath, because you can't hold on to it like we can't hold on to it like we were before, because everything's changing so much. So those are two things that I highlighted.
That's so interesting. Before so the piece here about a crisis of faith, I think is a really, really big deal culturally, sociopolitically. No matter
Yeah.
what your individual thing is, maybe you are individually having a crisis of faith, like some of us in this room might be, but it's also, this kind of wider cultural thing that's going on here, like, and that's part of like our what gets to be considered as real or as true, and so is spirit a real thing? Is God a real thing? Is there a higher power at all, or is there not? Is it possible that there's not? You know what I mean? And there's kind of a crisis in figuring out what even am true there. And so one of the things that so in our pre-chat a couple of days ago, Cameron, you used this word that I really loved. You called yourself a heretic. And
Mhm.
I think that is so on point, especially for Pluto moving into Aquarius, and that very first degree of Aquarius and the first decan there of Aquarius. It's very heretical. This is a space where it's, you know, we've got exile here. And one of the images that I learned about in 36 Faces was there's an olive-skinned man whose hair is tied up in knots, who sits at the edge of town, who knows how to do magic. And so there's like, like it's the bog witch here, you know what I mean?
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so why would, there's this question of like, why would you want to live in a bog in the first place, or why would you be at the edge of town? But to see Pluto moving into this space all in a couple of weeks here, and moving, and that changing this whole era over, not to mention that first degree of Aquarius, that's where we got the great conjunction, but now we're getting this Pluto there as well, really sort of ratcheting that up. And so I wonder if heresy is gonna be important here.
Mhm. Yeah, it's got to be, to me, like even just thinking about the climate of people dissolving their like faith in governments and stuff like that. Just even thinking about like the Nord Stream pipeline, and like us not wanting to go to war, and
Mm-hmm.
people are starting to like be actually like aware of that, and their idea of, their sense of patriotism that was just like a delusion the whole time. A lot of
Mm-hmm.
people are starting to like feel into that too as well. So hopefully people feel into it and actually start taking action to it. But yeah, that's just something that comes up when you say that, like that loss of faith, in the higher power, but also in the people who are supposed to be the higher powers that are supposed to be helping us and keeping the structure in place.
Especially if Saturn is not in dignity anymore, and so the organizations and the management isn't making the thing happen anymore.
Right, right. 1,000%. Mm.
Yeah, and
I've
like
been
people just coming around to what has not been acceptable to. It's like you live on the edge of
Mhm.
town so that you can be active at night without everyone noticing. And so it's like what energy does that bring to like our collective lives too? And like, yeah, what part of that contributes to how we participate in the social structure, depending, even while we're having these crises of faith, right? Like, where do we find the stability amongst others? And it's like, how many people are awake at night? Like, how much solidarity do you feel with other people who are like awake at night? Right? There's something there. And so Saturn in Pisces to me like brings a little bit more openness to that kind of relating.
Beautiful. Yeah. That's interesting, like the people at the edge of town, because I just did a reading yesterday for somebody in Australia, and that's what they were saying. Actually, they were saying everybody's moved to the beach away from like the city. And so that's just like so spot on. That's really interesting.
For sure. Yeah, you know, and Saturn ruling Aquarius, Saturn is associated with borders and boundaries and this sort of stuff. And so the edge of the land is where the land meets the sea. That's big Saturn energy there for sure.
Ooh, I have a fun Saturn in Aquarius, Saturn in Pisces, like mundane thing that happened that's related to this. So the one of the UN organizations in charge of the law of the sea, which that organization was actually ratified in 1994 when the Saturn was last in Pisces. So they finally, after a long time, signed this treaty called the High Seas Treaty, and it's about the offering ways to conserve and protect the areas that are outside of national jurisdiction in the ocean. So it's like however 500 kilometers or whatever off of any beach, right? And so it's this way of like, in some ways, giving like Saturnian structure to this area, like that's so much of the earth, right? That has been without those kind of mechanisms in order to govern it. And so it's like being able to, like, what commercial fishing is going to be allowed in these high seas, right? It's like, what kind of oil drilling is going to be allowed here? There's now these like global mechanisms in order to govern that stuff, which there hasn't been before. And that treaty was signed just like 2 days before Saturn entered Pisces.
Spot on.
Spot on. Spot on.
For sure.
Like the deepest oceans are suddenly like within international jurisdiction. It's like, what?
I wonder how effective that's going to be.
Yeah,
you know, like with Saturn.
This is not giving any kind of credence to like the UN treaty structure and all that.
Yeah, sure.
Like,
yeah, I'm not
very interesting.
We're gonna talk about war and all type of shit on here. We are not endorsing any of this shit.
Yeah.
Right? Predictions are not endorsements. They are not the same thing. But it's interesting to hear about laws of the sea being coming up for Saturn in Pisces, you know what I mean? But then also Saturn in Pisces, you know, like I don't expect any of the management or structures or the governmental organizations, even the strong governments, I don't expect them to be as strong as they are currently at the end of Saturn in Pisces, right? And so it makes me wonder, especially in the high seas, like who's really looking in the high seas? You know, like seems like a good place to get away with shit.
Well, and it's like the people who are in the high seas are definitely not the ones writing the treaty.
Right. There's that too.
There's some complications there for sure.
For sure. And this kind of leads back into the heresy component a little bit. You know what I mean? Like there's a certain sense of like lawlessness, you know, like if you're gonna make a South Node talisman or something like that, then like, you know what I mean? Like do whatever you want to do because it's not in the text. The laws are not gonna govern this area. You know what I mean? Like they'll try to make laws, but you can also do whatever you want. That's part of, you know, I think about, Cameron, you look like you have something to say. After I directly
I was just thinking, totally. I was just thinking about like all the things like going on with East Palestine in Ohio, and like the perverting of water, and like just thinking about also like I've heard Ali Alomi, he said the beginning of like the water wars in general and like
Yeah.
who's taking control of the water, and like, is water being protected? What are the boundaries around water? Are there people trying to like lord over the water? And so, and then also people just not having clean water, and that being like a huge thing. And so that's something too as well with Saturn and Pisces. I just was like feeling into what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah, and Saturn in Pisces is one thing, and then pretty soon, at the end of the month here, we're gonna see Mars moving into Cancer, and so that's two malefics in the water, you know,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
which as a beginning push for Saturn in Pisces feels like some that like there might be some bad stuff in the water to begin us here. And then that makes me kind of wonder, I'm still thinking here a little bit about this Pluto and Aquarius. This is going to be such a big deal here for so long. And then thinking with Pluto as like a generational shift, if we think about Pluto and Scorpio as millennials and Pluto and Sagittarius as Gen Z, and I don't even know if Capricorn has a name yet, but then Pluto and Aquarius, are we going to have a generation of heretics? Like a whole generation of people who don't trust authorities, who don't trust religious establishments, who prefer to live on the edges, who prefer a certain amount of piracy or something like this, perhaps.
Well, they are the mirror of the Pluto and Leos, right? And it's like
Mm.
now, of course, the Pluto and Leos are like very standard, like they are the status quo. But at the height of them being youth, like they were pretty radical, right? They were pretty heretical themselves. And so to be able to like see that kind of mirror potential, right? Where it's like the Pluto and then the Pluto and Scorpios, right? We're kind of like the middle, we're the square between those two generations. And like, what does that say about us? And how do we contribute to these Pluto and Aquariuses, like this Pluto and Aquarius generation, like thriving in whatever this world is turning into, right? Like however the new age of air is, we're just at the beginning of this thing. And they're the ones who are gonna like mainly grow up in it.
Yeah, and I've been thinking about too, like if Capricorn was the old structure, it's like, and that was like what was the tradition or what is orthodox at the time, then moving forward, like what is going to be the new tradition that people are trying to like make crystallize moving forward too as well. So I'm just like looking at that and excited about it too, because it's going to be the first time I'm going to actually be able to watch a whole Pluto cycle, God willing. It'll be the first time I'll be able to see a whole Pluto cycle happen. So yeah, I'm super interested and curious. And also that square to everybody with Pluto and Scorpio, and like what is that going to do for us as well? It seems like it's going to be like really big.
Yeah, that Pluto and Aquarius really brings up the fixed sign dynamic in a big way, in a way that like you want, if you've got stuff in fixed signs, you want to break because Saturn left Aquarius and you want to be like, whew, done with that. But you kind of don't get it because you still got Uranus, you still got eclipses, you still got now you got Pluto moving into that space as well. So you don't get that kind of thing. But so that kind of takes us into also Jupiter is going to move into Taurus during this quarter, and that is going to be an important progression along this. So we had the Great Conjunction in 2020, and that was with Jupiter and Saturn, and they were conjunct. They were together in the same space at 0 degrees of Aquarius. And so then now we've got a sextile from Jupiter in Pisces to Saturn, or Jupiter in Taurus to Saturn in Pisces. And so now Pisces or Pallas, I know you've got a lot to say about that cycle. Would you sort of bring that out for us a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. I feel like we always talk about like the Jupiter Saturn conjunction in Aquarius, but I mean, that's like, we know that starts like a 20-year cycle, right? Like 2040, we're already looking at the next Jupiter Saturn conjunction. So what we're dealing with now, we're just still at the very, like, yes, we're at the very beginning of that 200-year cycle. We're also still at the beginning of this specific 20-year Jupiter Saturn cycle, because we only had that conjunction in like end of 2020, which I guess that is a while ago now, but doesn't feel that long ago. And so this sextile is happening. So it's like in June, right? We have the sextile. That's the part way point before we get to the square, which is like the real activation. Like at that opening square, we'll really see how that conjunction that happened in 2020 is like truly playing out, what kind of crisis it's actually causing. In this sextile, we're sort of like the forces are kind of coming together, and it's like as Jupiter especially is moving, because it moves faster, right? And it's just activating this Saturn as Saturn's moving slower through the signs. It's like the Jupiterian forces, right? So what we're talking about here when we're talking about faith, we're talking about religion, we're talking about belief. It's like all these things. How are those shifts then impacting like the Saturnian structures? And so we have the sextile in June 2023, and then that opening square is really defining of the end of 2024 into 2025. We have 3 of them. And so they're shifting from, and in that one, they're shifting from mutable signs into cardinal signs. So it's like the shift from Saturn in Pisces into Aries is going to be in part defined by the Jupiter-Saturn square that we're seeing a little glimpse of in the sextile now. It's easy now, like it'll get harder then. That's sort of like the nature of the sextile to the square aspect. So yeah, we're in that like the opening, the overture, I guess, of it right now.
Sure. Jupiter in Taurus. Cameron, do you have any ideas about that?
Yeah, one thing I've been thinking about a lot is just like just from, especially from my projected perspective at the current moment, it's just like being able to expand our essential needs, you know, and like remove obstacles that are keeping us from just having the regular normal things that we really need. You know, I've been thinking about like the railroad workers and stuff like that, and how they're not even allowed to have like 7 sick days. And it's like it's just crazy to me, like things like that. So it's just like, how can we remove the obstacles that are keeping us from just like getting things that we need on a fundamental level? You know, in evolutionary astrology, Taurus corresponds to just like, yeah, like the essential needs. It's like what do I value and what I desire, like my house, my home, and stuff like that. And so issues with that are just like getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And so the Jupiter's beginning ability with it going into Taurus is just like how are you like maintaining just like basic things. And then also thinking about like the relationship with the earth, and how are you removing the obstacles that are keeping you from just like being with your feet outside and just like being with earth and building that relationship as well.
Well, Taurus is so important to the Pluto and Scorpio generation too, like also especially coming from like an EA perspective, right? It's like the Taurus as kind of this answer, or this frame for our Pluto and Scorpio paths, right? And it's so and I was just writing about this actually, but it's like the Pluto and Scorpio generation, so much of it is about like the story of how do we navigate our needs amid like this current scorpionic reality of like grief and change and loss. Like I've been thinking so much about biodiversity, right? And just like the biodiversity loss that's happening. It's like, how do we wrangle with that while also, because that's also a Jupiter and Taurus question, right? Like Jupiter and Taurus is also like, you know, it's big animals. It's like who's going extinct, and it's like how do we navigate thriving and like collective thriving as well as individual in the face of these like big like martial questions, like Plutonic questions. And so Jupiter into it's like this Pluto in Aquarius, right, comes into aspect square all of our Pluto and Scorpios, but we also have this Jupiter coming in to be in like an opposition to all our Pluto and Scorpios, right? And so really bringing the awareness from that, like those griefs and those losses into like, okay, well, how do we bring that benefic into our lives now, right? And yeah, like connection with the earth is going to be huge in that.
Yeah, something else with Jupiter and Taurus that I've been thinking about is now that Saturn has gone into Pisces and Jupiter going into Taurus, and both of them being in feminine principle signs, and like from a medical astrology perspective, how that might slow down the metabolic ability to like digest and process things as well. So that's always something to look out for too, because Pisces can easily create stagnation in the lymphatic system, especially with Saturn there. And then Jupiter and Taurus is like the growth is like it's happening at an exponential rate, and so that can also create stagnation. So one thing I would say, not to alarm people, but if somebody has anything going on with the thyroid things, that would be the first thing I would look to. Because with medical astrology, you can't just cast it for the whole planet, but it's like things specifically that we can look for when those things happen. So just being mindful of your metabolic rate and how you're digesting and processing things, because it could get a little more sticky and slow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm also looking at Jupiter and Taurus as kind of so Jupiter's job is often to say yes to things or to confirm things, to affirm things. And so Jupiter is going to move into Taurus and start saying yes to Uranus and start confirming North Node things, And so I think what you said about a labor movement or these kinds of disruptions, I think are likely, we're likely to see some kind of, like, that's been building for a while. One of the things that I've been saying to clients a lot is that this year really looks like a year where Taurus wants to shift. Like, it's like Taurus has been trying to shift for a while. You know what I mean? Like, there's been pushes and there's been this kind of like rumbling going on, but in lots of ways there's been Saturn there to, Saturn in Aquarius has been overpowering that and being like, okay, you can move, but only this much, only within these boundaries. And I'm just going to hold it up. And now that Saturn is all mushy, then that Uranus is going to be like kind of unencumbered, right? And then Jupiter is going to be like, yeah, fuck it up. And so then it's going to turn into, you know what I mean? Like, I feel like, and then add to that we've got North Node eclipses there going on at the same time. And so then that's a real catalytic kind of situation where it looks like all this stuff that has been building up in Taurus since 2018, since Uranus moved in there, that looks like it really wants to break and shift and like really go. I wonder if there's going to be like volcanic stuff and this kind of thing.
Well, and then Venus moves into Leo, like already in this quarter, Venus moves into Leo, but then we have that long retrograde activating all of it.
Right.
That is some faith enacted. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Venus and Leo is going to be a trip. That's going to be a real trip for sure.
That's next quarter mostly, though.
That's next quarter. We're coming into that. So, like, I feel like throughout 2023, I think we're looking at the main events really taking place in in this quarter that we're looking at now and next quarter. So spring and summer in the Northern Hemisphere. Like, I think that is really when like the big stuff wants to take place. That's when we get the Pluto ingress. Pluto is actually only going to be in Aquarius during this quarter this year. So we're going to get Pluto moving forward for a little while and is going to station in that first degree of Aquarius and then is going to retrograde out. Do you guys remember when the station is? The Pluto station? Cameron,
yeah,
I know you had a whole...
May 1st.
May 1st. Okay. May 1st.
Mercury
Really? May
Kazemi
1st? Like
too.
in between the eclipses and all this? Oh my goodness. Okay.
Yeah. Mercury Kazemi and Taurus that same day.
Oh yeah. All right. Party over here. So it really, so yeah, we've got that Pluto joint is going to happen at that moment. And then Pluto's going to move out. And then Pluto's going to be back into Capricorn for the rest of the year. And we'll do more Pluto and Aquarius in life, but that's only happening this quarter. And then we've got stuff moving up into Leo as well. So Mars is going to make it all the way through Cancer, and then it's going to make it up into Leo, and then Venus is going to start to catch up in Leo, and those folks are going to oppose Pluto, and they're going to square all the stuff at Jupiter and Uranus and whatever in Taurus. And so then that is going to sort of begin our next quarter journey where we're looking at Leo things, Leo and Taurus kind of primarily at that point. So where the first or the last one we did, this last bit we did here of the winter time, that was very much retrospective. That was like, okay, so where have we been in the past 5 years or so? What, or the past 200 years? How has this been going for us? How do we feel about all this? And now it's like, all right, lace up your boots because we are going forward. New things are happening out here, and it's wild, and it's not intelligible. It is very uncertain, but onward and awkward, as I always say. So, so let's see. The other big things that are going on here are the eclipses. Do y'all want to talk about the eclipses a little bit?
Yeah, before we go into the eclipses, I wanted to talk about the ingress just a little bit.
Okay,
The
sure. Tell me
ingress
about it.
chart.
Oh, you want to bring up the
little
ingress
funky.
chart now? All right, let's do it.
Yeah.
Is that it?
Beautiful. Yeah, that's it right there.
Cool.
Yeah, so just from like the techniques that I'm learning right now as far as mundane / world astrology, we first look to the ascendant, and the ascendant is a mutable sign. So that's saying that we'll have to cast 2 charts for the year. And it also says that whatever's going on with this ingress has already began, because it's kind of like it's here, and this is the ingress moving forward into this quarter, but it kind of already was starting in the last quarter as well. And so having Mercury as the ruler in the 8th house, just off the top there, and it's combust, and it's in a aversion to the ascendant. It's just like a lot of things are just like we don't necessarily have full autonomy of like what's going on and how we don't have our hands on the reins here. And then it being the 8th house, and with all the things going on with the pandemic, and people not paying attention to it, that's also in the 8th house, and it's hidden, and there's still like things that are happening having to do with death. And also, since it's Mercury, there's something here about youth or young people happening. And so that's something that's like really, really highlighted as well. Also, when we look at this chart, the way we look at dignity from this perspective, or what rules the chart, we can look at the ascendant. We can also look at the planet that has the most dignity in the chart. And the planet that has the most dignity in the chart here is Venus. And Venus is in the 9th house. So, and since this is casted from the United States, we could see here that something having to do with like women's rights is going to be happening in the 9th house. So like laws around women in a foreign place specifically, or maybe just around like the laws in general is going to be highlighted. Also, something I learned from Dr. Alomi is that Venus also represents trans people as well. So laws around those things are still going to be highlighted. With the North Node there, I can't say that I can be super particular about the mundane projection of what's going to happen there, but I assume that it's going to be a lot for a lot of people. And a lot of people are going to be looking to like be able to process and digest the things that are happening around the laws there. And so one thing that I would say is a word of caution: just don't get ahead of yourself and don't lose your head around these things, because we need something sustainable to happen in reference to women's rights and trans rights and stuff like that. So you want to be mindful not to lose your head about it in general. And then another way we can look at what's the Lord of the year, the ruler of the year. They look at Saturn in Jupiter, and then they see which one is more angular. And here we have Saturn more angular. So we have more Saturn going on here. Saturn is like only a few degrees away from the descendant. And so that's going to be something that's really powerful and strong within the year, or the quarter rather, but the year and the quarter. And so also the thing around a lot of things around water, and just like how is it being contaminated? How is it being, what boundaries do we have around water and things like that? So just being mindful of all those things for this quarter, but also knowing that the Aries ingress for the spring is for the whole year as well. So always looking at this chart and then referencing back to it when you're looking at other transits, and not just having transits in a silo. So those are just like a few things that I was like tapping into.
Yeah. So it's important to remember that this chart is the for Washington D.C. So we're thinking specifically from an American perspective here. We can see that Mars is in the 10th. So so that looks, it looks violent, certainly, in a day chart, no less. And so Mars is in the 10th, and that's the ruler of this ingress, of this Aries ingress, and so there's definitely like a push there. We can also see that Saturn is in the 7th, and so that looks like an opposition or a fighter. You know what I mean? Like it looks like an enemy of some sort. So this definitely looks, and then at the same time, so that Mars in Gemini that's ruling the ingress and everything, that's square to Neptune also, and so that looks like maybe warring on bad information, warring in a confused way, warring in a disembodied way. We've seen more and more of this sort of like robot war situation happening. When I first was looking at Mars retrograde in Gemini like a year and a half ago, I was thinking that it was going to be like cyber warfare, and it was going to be like sort of like hacking in and shutting off systems and stuff like that. But I think that the way that it's actually been is much more of this sort of like RC fighter drone situation, and then also it's been information warfare, but less like anonymous hacking in and stopping things from happening or something like that, and more narrative displacement, more confusion, more like divisive politics and divisive ideation that has really been the weapon there. And so this looks to me like it wants to continue. This looks like it wants to escalate at this time.
Yeah, and then Mars being in the 10th house of the government, and it ruling the 3rd house of like where we disperse information and social media and stuff like that too. So that just like is a double emphasis on what you just said. So that makes total sense. Yeah. Also, something else I'm seeing here too as well, just with Venus being in the 9th house and ruling the 2nd house, it's like something about the money in the United States being sent somewhere else into a foreign place. And so that looks great for them, but it doesn't necessarily look the greatest for us, especially since we got Mercury in the 8th house there. And so we're feeling like at a financial loss, or we have some debts here, but money is good in a foreign place.
Yeah, that's Saturn in Pisces, and the 7th speaks to that too, I think.
Cool. So gonna be a fun year. And
so when we're looking at the eclipses, we're partially thinking about them from this perspective as happening in this 3rd and 9th.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Something else here too, just like with the moon, even though it's so the moon with Neptune, just the people are confused too as well, just like from a more like evolutionary astrology perspective. It's like feeling a sense of like overwhelm and hopelessness about something that's going on somewhere else, or maybe even just like being in delusion about what we're doing with other countries, like what is our foreign politics with other people, and people not even being tuned into that at all, and that being like one of the reasons why the war actually like takes place, with the Neptune being in that square with Mars and that moon being in conjunction with Neptune. So the people are confused, and that's one of the reasons why the government has an ease in going to war as well. Nothing new there really though.
Right, indeed. And when Mercury combusts the sun, like there's no information, like there's and whatever information you have is trash information also.
Yeah, well said. Yeah. Also something about Mercury being combust and it being hidden by the sun. Just like the things going on with COVID, and just like there are things that are hidden that are going on with that, with the health of the people and stuff like that too. So it's just like being mindful of that and taking wise precautions, and also not going into a state of fear, because the 8th house doesn't just represent death. It represents the things that we fear more than death. And sometimes we have to know where that line is at. Yeah.
What you said there about not taking a sort of doom and gloom stance or attitude with it. Um, it's interesting to me to see that Pluto is still in Capricorn in this chart in the fifth house. And so there's a kind of delight or pleasure that can be had in the Pluto space, in the transformation, compost, stinky, gross, death, rotting, all that sort of stuff. There's a kind of delight that can take place there. And so on the one hand, there's this distortion of social media and body dysmorphia and all of the rest of that stuff that I think can we can see that sort of stuff in the Pluto, and Pluto in a pleasurable place, you know what I mean? Like there's a kind of like there's a kind of pleasure to be had in fantasizing about something terrible, fantasizing about a fight or something like this, you can like get some pleasure from that. But at the same time, I wonder if there might be some kind of creative transmutation that might be worth looking into if you find yourself in this place of despair and hopelessness or something like that. Like there might be a kind of medicine in remembering that death is, that's part of the thing, and there's something maybe beautiful, fun, delightful, pleasurable about that as well.
Yeah, I feel that.
Yeah, there's something I'm thinking about here. I glanced at my ephemeris. And so in the Libra chart, Jupiter is in Taurus at that point, and it had just stationed retrograde in Taurus. And there's something about what we were talking about like the labor movements and workers, and this idea that like their needs are externalized into the prices of consumer products, right? And the crises around shipping, people are becoming like more aware of how the workers' needs and well-being is being externalized for the sake of profit. And just there's something here in this Venus Uranus North Node, and in the story of Jupiter getting in there too. I'm feeling that here too, and that itself has something to do with like people coming into relationship with their own pleasure in a way that comes out of like a pretty dark place. Yeah,
it's like how do you navigate finding pleasure even when it's dark outside? Like one of the things that I've been thinking about is like, so there was like a big trucker strike here and this kind of thing, and this was like a year and a half ago, something like this, and then it kind of evaporated, and you can still get next day shipping on Amazon or whatever, you know what I mean? And so but that has been with Saturn in Aquarius, and now Saturn is moving into Pisces, and the infrastructure isn't going to be at the same level anymore, and Uranus is going to have kind of free reign to shake things up and break things as it will. And so I wonder if we're going to start seeing all of the predictions about supply chains and all this sort of stuff. I wonder if we're going to start seeing that actually falling down, at least in this corner of the world. You know what I mean? Who knows what it's already like in Sri Lanka or whatever, you know what I mean? But like here in this area where we have been, our people have been managing the world or whatever, in the manager space, we're going to see some problems with that, I would think. And then that pressure might sort of lead to what you were talking about, Pallas, about like, navigating that and being able to find pleasure in the ways that you still can. What are those ways? We're going to have to figure that out,
Yeah, I'm thinking about Jupiter or Saturn and Pisces too, and this complicated relationship with Jupiter and Capricorn and the node and this whole story as sort of part of this, and Uranus and Taurus more generally, right, is this sort of like degrowth movements and like learning with less. And one of the things I was some of the research I was doing a couple weeks ago was looking at more in depth into this biodiversity loss report that was put out in 2019. And one of the biggest recommendations that they make is one of the biggest interventions into all of these issues, both like climate change and biodiversity loss and like global inequity, is introducing people to other visions of a good life, to different visions of a good life that are detached from like consumer productivity and consumption, right? And so this completely ties into so it's like one of the, you know, outside of like government protocols and them attempting these like treaties and, you know, all of that, consumer habits, there's this introduction of, yeah, different visions of what a good life means as being, you know, this UN sanctioned, like science sanctioned way to intervene in these like global crises. I've been sitting with that a lot and thinking about that with Saturn in Pisces and Jupiter in Taurus.
Yeah, I think Jupiter in Taurus is going to be really good for that. Expanding the horizons of possibility. Like, what kinds of things can be good? Did you realize that there are other things that are good too?
Yeah. There's even this wave coming back of like specific grains in Africa that they use that they're like growing more of and they're like making more popular. One that is like, it's a dear food to me at this point in my life right now. It's called fonio. And then people in Africa have been growing fonio more. And fonio not only is super easy to grow in Africa, but it also actually remineralizes the soil. So it's like literally there would be no such thing as over cultivating fonio because you would be cultivating the land while you cultivate the fonio. So anyway, I love fonio.
I love that. Yeah, some of the biggest biodiversity loss and recent extinctions have happened in domesticated seed varieties, which is just like wild to think about. It's like so cultivating like a diversity of wheat or a diversity of vegetables, not just tomatoes, but like 100 different kinds of tomatoes, right? There's this, that kind of diversity, like among a population, is like really essential to recuperating those losses and to rebuilding the soil. Like so much of it's about the dirt.
And so, if we are thinking with biodiversity in an earthly kind of way, in a way that is embodied, and thinking about how diversity strengthens the whole community, I wonder what that means in the era of air when we're thinking with communication and ideas and all the rest of that.
Yeah,
Delicious.
not shutting everybody down with their ideas. Really, it's like that's just something I see so strongly. People being so strong in their opinions that they just like shut other people down, and that's like destroying the diversity of their own thoughts and the diversity of people that we can engage with in general. So I mean, that's super big in an embodied way as well. Just thinking about, are you taking probiotics? And like also like, are you putting dirt on your skin? And how has your relationship been with your community, in your body, in your, you know, it's like such an important thing. You know, there's been a few people within the last few weeks that I've worked with, and I've just talked to them about like going on walks and being in relationship with the community that is the plants and trees around them, and how can you bring in more diversity that way too as well, variety of community, internally, externally.
One of my Saturn and Pisces things is that I'm a Sag rising, so it's my fourth. And it rolls my third. I started going to like the community pool and like doing lap swimming. That's like my new thing. And it's like a spring, it's at the college. So it's like a spring water pool that's like low chlorination, which also means it's like a little gross, you know, but in a way that speaks to that, right? It's like, oh, like the people who swim here are the people who, like, they're my neighbors, you know, and we're like sharing this water that's like the spring water. And It's like in the summer, people do like lap swimming in the local lake, and it's like that in itself. And yeah, just like being in the water with your neighbors, like what does it's like, yeah, it's, I don't know, it's just juicy. So I'm thinking with that, and it feels reflected in what you just shared.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like Saturn in Pisces is going to be real good for soup.
Mm.
You know, like the soup is going to be at times terrible. You know what I mean? Well, there will be like vinyl chloride in the soup and this kind of stuff. But like, you know, and that's to my mind, that's like part of, you know, I've been thinking about Austin Coppock called Pluto and Capricorn. He called them grim little builders, right? And so I've been thinking about these children who who have this world that they're gonna like live in and grow up in, and part of it is gonna be engaging with gross shit in the soup. Like there's gonna be nasty stuff in here, and there's gonna be bad for you and stuff like that, and you gotta navigate that. You've got to interface with that. You got to touch it and interface with that. And so, and I think that an effective way for us to, you know, ride this wave might be a little bit less. So like there's going to be a lot of folks are going to try to sort of helicopter mom it, you know what I mean? Just like stronger boundaries, like more Saturn rigidity. And but Saturn is not in position to do that right now. And so that might backfire. And so a better way of riding that wave might be to get in there with the soup and be like, this is kind of gross, but like maybe there's some medicine there. Maybe it's kind of good to get gross sometimes.
Yeah, if people are going to keep trying to do the Saturn thing, they're not going to get Saturn, they're going to get Pluto.
Ooh. That's real good.
Yeah. Sometimes I say things and I'm like, oh God.
I know, it's it's gross. So speaking of malefics, let's talk about Mars a little bit. Because Mars has been retrograde in Gemini. Mars moved into Gemini in, I think, September of 2022, and then has just been in that space, moving forward, then backward, and now forward again, and is now at this moment. So in this Ingress chart, we saw Mars was at 27 degrees of Gemini. That's at the very end of the shadow there. I think Mars's shadow ends at 28 degrees of Gemini. And then Mars is going to move forward into Cancer. And as we get that Mars into Cancer, that's going to be Mars away from all the Gemini stuff. So that's the one thing. But then that's going to also be Mars moving into its fall, and then ruling not only the solar eclipse that we get in Aries, but also the lunar eclipse that we get in Scorpio later. So how are y'all feeling about this Mars and eclipses?
I honestly don't. I'll just come out and say I don't feel good about it. Also, just like something that's been really highlighted for me looking at where Mars is doing. It's like going to move into Cancer, and then right before it moves into Leo, it's going to be in it's going to be in the opposition with Pluto too. As soon as it goes into Leo, rather, and as soon as it goes into Leo, it's going to be in that opposition with Pluto. And so that's going to be really intense. And then not only that, but it also during this quarter is going to square the nodes a lot. And then it's also going to be at the square point of the eclipses. And I'm looking for those times to be times that are like really highlighted. And so it's just like I'm looking for Mars to be malefic, as it always is, but it just seems like it's like even more highlighted for me. Yeah. And I'm just, I'm always warning people about their adrenal glands, but it's just like, sure. That's just like something that I'm like feeling into a lot again, as always. So I'm just, that's what I've really been focusing on, that from a more medical astrology perspective, and just like watching how the fallen Mars works with the eclipses, and then going into those square points with the eclipses. It's a bit much.
Yeah. And right after this, right after Mars enters Cancer, it's in a trine with Saturn, which I think we already mentioned, but that's like the next, it already made those trines with Saturn through the retrograde, but in Gemini to Aquarius, right? So there is this like malefic on malefic getting along, right? And it's like that was, that was like the old story, right? That was like this us getting accustomed to the new age of air, and like the ways that the malefics can express in that. We've definitely gotten a taste of what that can do. And so this is like the shift into water and being like, okay, like how does this look like now? And so from this, like, yeah, Mars in Cancer to this Saturn in Pisces, and the fact that the Mars in Cancer transit starts off like right with that, feels the waters of the body and otherwise, risky, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Protection and safety comes up a lot with that too. Just like people feeling safe or not feeling safe is really strong with Mars going through Cancer. And then with the eclipses happening, it's just like the idea of, or the feeling of safety, it just doesn't look like it's like really there. So just like really inviting people to feel into like, what is your idea of safety, and how are you emotionally identifying with how you're asserting your feelings of not feeling safe, and are you actually asserting yourself to make yourself feel safe or protected or comfortable for yourself? So if you're going to go to war about, you probably need to start in your like immediate environment rather than projecting it out into the world. So yeah, I think that's important too.
Well, yeah, like starting with the body, definitely. Yeah, the fact that this Jupiter is so combust through this first bit too feels powerful too. Like we have that Cazimi on April 11th at 21 Aries, and it's like it's framed by this Venus trine Pluto and Venus square Saturn within a couple days. That feels like what you're talking about, because that's right before the eclipses. The question, and that Taurus Scorpio axis, right? And this Pluto in Scorpio, it's like existential fear is a very prominent theme for Pluto and Scorpio generation folks.
Yeah, and even with that Cazimi, you got like just thinking about like
Jupiter
potential
Cazimi
fear
in Aries, right?
Yeah, Jupiter Cazimi in Aries, just with the potential fear, the Mercury Uranus conjunction as well, just like kind of amp ups the nervous system too. So just like being mindful of that. And then Taurus being about essential needs and like things that the basic needs that we have. And yeah, just being mindful of that, all those things happening at the same time. And then Chiron being there and people feeling really energetically sensitive to all these things. It is really a sensitive time now that I like explore that in this moment. It's super sensitive.
Yeah, that's Saturn and Pisces. Oh, I remember we talked about, I don't think it was the last time, it was maybe the time before that, but when we talked about this like shift of boundaries and like the recognition or the sort of maturation of boundary discourse, even into like understanding that they do need to have this fluidity and flexibility in order to actually be strong rather than rigidity. And the Saturn in Pisces feels very like that. And one of the things these couple of weeks we're in right now feels especially like that, because Pluto hasn't moved into Aquarius yet, but we're kind of moving through this period of recognizing that the rigidity has not served so much, and wanting more fluidity, but not necessarily knowing how to execute that, especially while this Jupiter is combust. Right. And so it's like, where is Saturn looking right now? And where is Saturn getting the guidance in order to support people in kind of renegotiating those Saturnian structures and boundaries that have kept them safe, or that they think have kept them safe over the past years? And so the sensitivity feels really alive in that.
Strong sensitivity. And then also, whenever I think about Mars in Cancer, I think it's often very moody. One of my one of my favorite, you know, with Mars being the planet of action and this kind of thing, one of my favorite ways of describing Mars in Cancer is I'll do it if I feel like it, you know? And
I'll
so,
do it when I feel like it.
sure. Yeah, like uh, it's and so I whenever I see this in a chart or I see somebody having to deal with Mars and Cancer on their whatever it is on their moon or whatever, then it's like, you know, make sure that you are aware that you might be hangry, right? This kind of thing. And so you know, like thinking back with that Ingress chart, the Aries Ingress chart. So the sun moving into Aries, and that had Venus in Taurus directly conjunct the North Node within like 10 minutes or something like that. And so then that looks like me and my desires are the main thing. More of that, more of what I want, you know?
Mhm.
And then so then that turns into this kind of moodiness, especially where there's a navigation of boundaries going on and there's uncertainty around where the boundaries are or what the boundaries should be or this kind of thing. Then that can generate this kind of moodiness that can be a major problem. And so, sort of to your point, Cameron, like a good place to start with that is in your own body and in your own. So if we can think about a productive way for Mars and Saturn to work together, we can think of plenty of unproductive ways for them to be for them to work together, right? They can fuck shit up big time when malefics are getting along. But if we can think of a way for them to work together in a productive and cooperative way, then we might be able to think about Saturn being personal responsibility, right? And there's a sense of like, okay, so if my boundaries are being infringed, how did I not communicate that boundary in the first place? How did you know, like how there are always ways that you can look at your own self and be like, okay, like I am in this thing and maybe the other person is like whack or whatever, but like, how did I contribute to this situation as well? Maybe I am hangry. Maybe I didn't sleep enough. Maybe I need to get on top of my routines. That's the other thing that I always talk about with Saturn. Can you sleep at night every day? Or this kind
Mhm.
of thing. You know what I mean? That might be a good way to um, keep your center throughout this time, you know, because it does
Yeah.
look like a time where, you know, Jupiter is not in position to help here. Venus is not really in position to help here. And so it's strong malefic stuff and malefics and signs that they don't even like that much. So it's, you know, it definitely looks like the kind of thing that we're going to have to navigate a lot of. And it also looks like the kind of thing where a lot of other people are not going to, a lot of people are not going to listen to this first and be like, oh, okay, well, maybe I have the hangries or something like that, right? And so people are going to come and be in your face. They're going to get in your face while you are trying to. I did my meditations this morning and I've been trying to, I ate some breakfast and all of this. And now I got somebody in my grill. I did not ask for all this, right? You're going to have this kind of thing going on around this time. And so, you know,
Mhm.
around the middle of Aries time and moving into early April and this kind of thing. And so that's just something to be aware of in maintaining your own center in your own space.
Yeah, and I think something else here too to say with is like being sure to assert how you feel in the present moment, and then also having the boundary to not self-sacrifice or to give way to other people's desires could be a big thing. Just like with the asserting of the emotions and how you feel, being the Mars in Cancer, and just being instinctual about expressing your feelings, but then also taking responsibility not to self-sacrifice in those moments as well with the Saturn and Pisces.
Ooh, girl, I'm going to try. I will
Yeah,
say
that's
that. I'm sorry, what was that, Palace?
I was gonna say that's also like a classic theme I've been seeing in this Chiron and Aries transit too.
Mm,
So having
Mm.
that Mars like coming into square that and it being so close to this Kazemi feels potent.
yeah. I will say that this sun in Aries is real tough on Jupiter, but looks great for the sun. You know,
Totally.
so if you want to do sun things, which
Totally.
will include health things, so if maybe you're like going to get your exercise routine together, maybe you're going to go out and you're going to run barefoot on the ground and get your little earthing in and all this, right? And that looks really good for this time. And so for asserting oneself even in uncomfortable ways, this does look good for that, sort of like shining my own light and being like, here I am, it's me up in here. This looks really good for that. But
Yeah,
kind of only, I'm sorry, what?
go ahead. Now go ahead, Zamboni. I'm listening.
I'm gonna transition. Or okay, cool.
Yeah,
So
I was gonna say with the sun going through Aries, I always invite people to like start new things having to do with their health, but don't necessarily think that you have the routine and structure down immediately, because Aries energy kind of likes to go in different directions with things. So just taking the time to like start the new thing and then focus on doing it consistently so that once the sun gets into Taurus, you can like lock that in. And then it'll have like extra help potentially from Saturn to like make the structure concrete. And you know, the help actually might be that it's more difficult at that time, so you can be mindful of it before it even happens.
Sure.
Yeah.
One thing that I always tell Aries to do is take a nap. Like, yes, go super hard for 3 hours, but then also take a 2-hour nap. And then you get a next morning after you do that, and you can go hard again, because Aries runs out of steam. That's just part of what it is. And Aries always thinks that they're not going to run out of steam, and then they get a couple hours in and they're like, I might die. So especially with all this Aries stuff being ruled by Mars in Cancer, like, take some time for rest and nourishment and these kinds of things, because you're gonna, with Sun Jupiter will do the most. It'll go overboard with things, and this is an exalted sun. This sun is going to want to be out here doing stuff. If it's nice outside, then it's going to be like, oh, sun's out, guns out, and I'm gonna fuck around and get a sunburn or some shit like that. You know what I mean? So like, so be aware of that kind of thing. And so that's a little bit where I'm going here with this, is that you know, so we've got this the sun looks so strong in this Aries moment, right? And then we get the sun in a shadow. We get the sun being eclipsed at the very end of Aries. And this is our very first Aries eclipse in what, like 9 years or whatever. The first one on the North Node in 19. And so we get to, things are going to change now. And so again, this is ruled by this Mars in Cancer here. And so how are y'all feeling about these eclipses? They are really there's really something, huh?
Yeah, I've already honestly. Go ahead, Pallas.
I was just gonna say the eclipses that change sign, that are in different signs, that aren't in opposition, are always like so curious. They're like set changes. And just like the difference between, you know, we're in one cycle coming into it, and then we come out the next side in like a different eclipse cycle. And it's just, I find that people can get a lot more disoriented around the eclipses when the nodes are changing signs. And so that's like one thing to think about in this kind of eclipse window, is that there are many different stories happening that don't all connect.
Yeah, because we got a new story that wants to take place with the Aries stuff, but then also North Node is still in Taurus, so we're still gonna be seeing that sort of stuff, and the South Node is still in Scorpio, and 2 weeks away from this, we're gonna get an eclipse in Scorpio. That's old themes at this point, you know. And then that's going to be, you know, once we get to that point. And then also, so one thing that's real important about this eclipse here is that it also features Mercury stationing retrograde on Uranus and Taurus. So how unrelated are these stories really?
Well, it's super Marsy too, right? It's like from an Aries eclipse to a Scorpio eclipse, like, yeah. Multiple expressions of this Mars Cancer.
It's interesting. I wasn't really even thinking about that Mercury so much. I was from that, like my evolutionary astrology brain was just like looking at this Pluto square, which is just like
Yeah.
so strong right there, you know, and just yeah, thinking about like from an evolutionary astrology perspective, and Aquarius oftentimes have to do with like subtle mental trauma and kind of like the information that we've carried, that the things that have happened over and over in our life. Not even like this type of trauma where it's like this one thing happened, I remember. It's like I was talking to somebody the other day and they were just remembering how they always had to like track what their father did, but he wasn't even necessarily like explosive, but they were always just like trying to figure out what their father would do all the time so that they can orient themselves. And so it's like really subtle in that way, but like really feeling into in what ways are you not just going after what you need and what you want in that Aryan way, because there's this subtle mental trauma in the background that's saying, I don't need to do that. I need to fragment from myself. And how do you keep going back and forth with that? You know, with the square to the nodes, it's like this yo-yo effect, back and forth, back and forth. I've been trying to finally move forward, but I feel like I can't. I've been trying to move forward, but I don't feel like I can. And so just really feeling into that during the eclipse and giving yourself a quiet time. You know, like what you were saying was sleep. It's like I would sleep. This doesn't necessarily seem like a sleepy eclipse, but I would sleep a lot here. So that's what I was feeling into with it.
Yeah, I'm thinking about Saturn and Pisces in dreams too, and I'm thinking about like how it's going to shift, how we relate to sleep period. But then thinking about this eclipse specifically, and that those like subtle body trauma too, and Uranus as like intergenerational trauma, and it's like how that stuff shows up in terms of like on a real body level, and like how do we tend to that if we don't even, we can't consciously necessarily know what we're carrying, especially if the stories have been lost or been kept secret, but it's like that's still there, we're still living with that. And so these eclipses and this Mars and Cancer, these stories feel like, yeah, with that Mercury Uranus there and that North Node, that feels like part of the story for sure. And like how to attend to like intergenerational trauma while like tending to our own like embodied needs feels connected there.
Yeah, and even just to add just a little touch more to that, that Saturn is in a trine to the South Node, and so it's like it's easeful for us to like feel into that thing that was happening from the perceived past, or the old emotional identity that's like moving forward in the way we need to like dissolve the boundaries in our consciousness around it is like really potent there. So yeah, there's a few points there that I see that are like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Even the Venus square there, it's like, even though it's moving away from it, yeah, all those things seem highlighted.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff happening there, and in a chart like this, it's like all of your house rulers are involved, and so it's very widespread, this kind of situation, and it looks a little bit like conflict of some sort, but then it's also like, Palace, what you were saying about like ancestors versus self seems like it wants to come through in a big way here, because whenever I think about Aries, then I think about like the first shoots of the spring, you know what I mean, like the very first, like, here we go, we're gonna do it, we're, like these brand new leaves, they're like so it's the greenest green you've ever greened in your life, right? And they're like, they're clearly tiny and babies, and they haven't been exposed to the brutality of like all of the weather and these kinds of things, like all that stuff. There's a kind of youthful component there that feels a little bit innocent, while at the same time this eclipse like feels like it like kind of doesn't give a fuck about that, is how it feels here, you know what I mean? And this, a lot of people, um one of the things that I have felt a lot in my ancestor reverence practice, as well as what I've heard from other people, is this sense of like, where the fuck are the elders at? Like, how come there are no elders? How come it's up to me, a child, to like break the patterns or whatever it is, you know what I mean? And there's like a kind of injustice to that the world, the brutal universe doesn't care about. It's like, okay, sure, you don't have any elders, but so what? And it feels like this eclipse series in Aries is likely to sort of push that in that way, while at the same time doing Mars things. You know what I mean? Doing super emotional Mars things. Mars in Cancer. Mars can't really, this is this moon and all this Aries stuff. This is square to Mars. This is one wants to get Mars active and going, doing the Mars things, like this looks like a good time for retribution if you are in some kind of conflict or some kind of like something like this looks like it definitely looks fighty, while at the same time that Mercury is just about to station retrograde there on top of that Uranus right there at the eclipse point, right? So we can think back to the North Node eclipse that happened in Taurus. Last one we had of those was in the fall time, and so then that is going to show up in some kind of major way as well. We can think about labor movements, we can think about territorial conquest, we can think about any of the earth sort of stuff that's going on, we can think about climate disasters and these kinds of things, like where it looks like it really wants to I don't know, show up in a big way around this time.
Yeah, and just to add just a little touch more about what you were saying about the DNA thing and the ancestor thing, like Pluto rules the DNA based off from my understanding and my perspective. So also that's coming in strong with the eclipse being in Aries and that feeling like starting something new or like being young, just being a tadpole, but then also being in connection to the ancestry and the subtle mental trauma that came through the DNA. And how are you going to confront that and be with it? So yeah, I just wanted to add a touch there.
Yeah, the necessity component of it feels prominent. Not like the kind of urgency that comes from necessity.
Exactly.
Yeah, the way that I talked about Saturn in Aquarius versus Uranus and Taurus was always necessity is the mother of invention. And so there's this sense, and so in a couple of weeks then we've got this lunar eclipse in Taurus as well also, right? So that to my mind really kind of gets into this, like the pressure of all the stuff makes you, so then so this lunar eclipse in Taurus here, this has the sun conjunct Uranus, and conjunct the last degree of the eclipses that was at 16, this one's at 15. It's like that necessity to do something different with land, with resource, with the good life, with body and this kind of thing, like a need for experimentation comes up really strongly here. And still, we're thinking about eclipses and shadows and uncertainty and all this kind of stuff. Like we can see that Mercury is still retrograde here, and not only is Mercury retrograde, but this is Mercury retrograde in the first decan of Taurus. This is the one that in the Rider-Waite-Smith tarot, this has the image of poor people outside a church who can't get inside. It's just cold and they're walking on canes, and like there's a fear around not being able to get inside in that image. And so there's that is big here. Yeah, big fear going on around this time. Not to mention Pluto moving into Aquarius, right? Pluto and Aquarius definitely gonna have some kind of existential fear. going on.
Yeah, and in the eclipse window, this is when Pluto stations retrograde.
The
Mhm.
first
And also the
retrograde
Mercury
station
stations
of Pluto
retrograde.
in Aquarius.
Yeah, something else I'm noticing here is this Venus at 27 degrees Gemini. That's exactly where Mars is at in the Aries ingress chart. So just like thinking about the things that I was talking about with Venus in the Aries ingress chart and how those things might light up right there because it hits the Aries ingress Mars in that chart. And then that Venus also squaring Neptune there. So it's like something about that like has like this strong feeling to it. It does have that sextile to Jupiter, but I still think, yeah, I haven't fully formulated anything about it, but I think that's something to watch out for strongly there.
It's
Well, and
confusing.
this is also Jupiter coming out of Phasis and rising as a morning star too, right? So Jupiter will be visible by this point, which will, I think, change the dynamic of Saturn in Pisces too by the time this happens.
Beautiful. Yeah, that makes sense.
Saturn does look like Saturn's in a position to help in Pisces. You know, that there's something Pisces and Taurus get along really well. And so having, you know, there's a firmness to Saturn even in Pisces that I think Taurus can really relate to. And so it looks that this definitely looks really nourishing. Is it nourishing the kind of stuff that you want? Well, some of it, especially
Yeah,
if
it's
you
like that.
lead with intention.
Yeah, that Mars with like the mutual fall with the moon and in that trine, and then like, but it's a Venus in aversion to Taurus. There's some ease, but there's some complications to that for sure.
Yeah, this Venus and Saturn trine here too is kind of interesting, even though it's out of sign. But that give me a second. Yeah, I think they're both in each other's bound here too as well. So there's like some like sneaky like kind of help going on there. And then also Saturn being in Venus's exaltation. So I think something there too there's gonna be some assistance, even though it's gonna be something that isn't going to be necessarily subjectively positive overall.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
like
like
the
maybe.
next week.
Go ahead, Pallas.
Oh, well, the trine perfects like a week later, and we also have the like Sun Uranus Cazimi within that week too. So that's also this part of this Venus story, right? So there is like that trine here it's applying pretty close. So it's like the visibility by aspect exists, even if the visibility by sign doesn't.
Right. Yeah.
And that Venus Saturn trine will be like the bomb to the Mars Saturn trine happening earlier in the quarter when Mars enters Cancer too.
Yeah.
That's an interesting point that you make there, because this reminds me about how these first eclipses are happening in Aries and in Scorpio, which are Mars signs. And then later in the year, we're going to get another set of eclipses, and they're going to be Venus ruled. We're going to get an eclipse in Libra and in Taurus. And so that's a similar shape where we've got strong Mars stuff going on here and super grumpy, right? Mars in its fall ruling stuff. Now that at that time is going to be those lunations, those eclipses are going to be ruled by Venus in Virgo, who will also be in a fall at that time. And so that'll be something else to think with at that time. And so I don't know if balm is the right way to think about that, but doing the Mars first and then following that with Venus seems like part of, I don't know, is that like a good cop bad cop situation where the bad cop roughs you up and it makes you feel better about the plea deal or something like this?
Well, these eclipses too are also framed by Venusian lunations, right? It's like the full moon before the Aries eclipse is the Libra moon, and then the new moon after the eclipse is Taurus moon, and neither of those are actually eclipses, right? So it's like we do get this And then that new moon also happens right after Jupiter has entered Taurus. So this is like there is like the Venusian sweetness happening in close proximity to the eclipses, as well as in this frame of like Mars eclipses first and then Venus eclipses. Yeah.
I'm curious. Yeah, and the eclipses that are coming with Venus, I wouldn't call them bombs either, to be honest. All of them, yeah, it looks troubling to me, honestly.
That's next. That's two.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's 2 quarters away. It was like, man. Right after this, we have like the Venus trine Saturn, Mercury stations direct. It's like Jupiter enters Taurus, Mars enters Leo. You know, it's like there's a little sunny time here right after this eclipse, I think.
Facts.
Sunnier, at least.
Yeah, definitely.
And then a Sag full moon. Who doesn't love a Sag full moon? I do.
Yeah, I do too. I'm looking forward to it.
And it's not an eclipse.
Word. Yeah. I'll take lunations that are not eclipses at this point. Whatever. Sure.
I mean, and I feel like
it's square to Saturn.
We've also talked about this. It's like I don't know if I'd say I'm a fan of eclipses. I close the blinds, you know, but
sure.
But also like energetically I kind of am, like they're quite important to my just to my magical practices and ancestral practices. Like they are really, if you kind of are confident and know what you're doing, they can be really powerful times of like inward work, right? And yeah, I mean, we had this conversation about the Scorpio Taurus eclipses last time, and like purging and all that good stuff, right? There are purposes for them, and they are necessary, even if a Sag full moon that's not an eclipse is like way more fun.
Yeah.
Sure.
I love eclipses.
Yeah.
I really do. I was born in between the middle of one too, so it's like, you know,
okay.
it's kind of like it just built into me. And I also find that it's like a strong time to be able to see like what are my demons, and like how am I looking to consume too much, and what am I not getting rid of? And that's beautiful and powerful to me. You know, it's like those are evolutionary gateways that people could be using more than fearing. To fear eclipse is to fear the identity that you have and what you're holding on to, from my perspective. So, yeah.
Word. Yeah, things can happen during eclipses that do not happen otherwise.
Say that again?
Things can happen during eclipses that do not happen otherwise. I mean, the portal's kind of like a joke at this point, but I do think about like eclipse windows as portals. Like,
for sure. I mean, when else do the nighttime bugs come out in the daytime?
It's like lift. Yeah, totally. Exactly. I love that. One thing right after that, one of the reasons why that full moon in Sag is, and we don't have to look at it, I think, but it's quite sweet, because Venus is the next day she hits her maximum elongation from the sun. So Venus is an evening star. This is like the highest in the sky she's going to get from the sun, like after the sunset. And it's also such a potent moment of like visibility and access to the Venusian in our chart. She's going to be right at the end of Cancer there. Yeah, it's just a really beautiful time, that like June 3rd, 4th. So people tuning into that there, because then the sun starts getting closer to her, and we're getting closer to her station retrograde. So it's the pinnacle of this part of the Venus cycle.
Yeah, I do think this Venus in Cancer is going to be sweet. It's definitely the sweetest thing that we have. Say again.
Yeah, no, after that, the day after that Sagittarius full moon too, the Venus squares the eclipse point, the
Mm.
Aries eclipse point. So that should be interesting too to note.
That's the Mercury Uranus conjunction too, perfecting.
Sure. So one thing that we are maybe getting ahead of here is Mars into Leo, which I think we should talk about
Yeah.
Yeah.
because Mars is so as Mars moves into Leo, then we are really, it's like as soon as Mars moves into Leo, then it's going to oppose Pluto, who is retrograde, and it's going to square Jupiter as well as the nodes. And so this is the 20th of May this year, and this day looks rough as shit. It is because we can see that the moon is in Gemini square to Saturn in Pisces also. You know, like I've been looking at this, and so I don't like Mars Pluto necessarily kind of ever. Mars Pluto is gonna like microscope enlarge the Mars thing, and so that looks extremely exciting to say the least. And then you can see that this square to Jupiter is going on here, and maybe a square to Jupiter is could be helpful or something like this. But this doesn't really look like Jupiter on his best behavior to me. Jupiter with the north node looks real like that can get greedy. More is better with that. To me, this looks like if you were gonna make a land grab, then this would be a real good day to do it. Like with power, with Pluto being a power play or something like this, and Mars being like, okay, it's time to move on the stuff, and Jupiter being like, yeah, let's get rich.
And that moon square Saturn, like some dispossession.
Yeah, and then Mars the day before was just at the eclipse square as well.
Oh yeah.
So it's just like, yeah, a lot of it is, yeah.
So you're saying that Mars at 29 degrees of Cancer is square to the eclipse at 29 degrees of Aries that happened a month ago.
Right. Thanks for that clarification.
Yeah.
Yeah. So as Mars moves into Leo, then that's going to give us that. This sort of shows us how the fixed signs are still going to be on, still doing. We're gonna have that opposition to Aquarius and square to Taurus, and then that's kind of the theme now, right? As we, the next one that's going to do that, we can see that Venus is in Cancer in this chart, but in a couple of weeks, Venus is going to move into Leo also. As Venus moves into Leo, then that is going to oppose Pluto and square Jupiter. And then that's going to be Venus and Leo for the next 4 weeks after, or 4 months after that, rather, doing Venus retrograde in Leo things, squaring Uranus and the old eclipse points and this kind of thing. And so there's a lot to be seen there as far as, fixed sign dynamics and the way that Leo is going to have to interface with pressures and dynamics, the necessity that we've been talking about, and the invention that's come out of that, and this kind of thing, maybe fear of Pluto and Aquarius, fear of the future, or fear of the heretic, or fear of bots and all the rest of it, you know what I mean? Like and that in relationship to the Leo thing, to the self thing, to and in one's ability to perform dramatically and perform beautiful things and maybe perform ceremony and all this kind of stuff seems to be important here.
And to lead. That's what I keep thinking
and to
about.
Lead, yeah, that's
I've been talking to my friend Ari Felix about this quite a bit, and it's like what Pluto and Aquarius means for Leo placements. And there's something huge about like the necessity of leadership and sovereignty, and just like what it looks like in the next world, and who's able to step up, and how a lot of folks with Leo placements who are taught to shine a little bit less, are probably going to
Right.
have to be wrangling with those feels.
Especially
Mhm.
after
Saturn.
as we start eclipses in Aries, you know,
Yeah.
if we
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
about Aries as being, an emperor or the one who wants to like sort of go out and do the stuff, and that's the sun's exaltation, like that is, if we've seen things get extremely solar in the past little while with content creation, and everybody's taking 1,000 selfies, and it's like all pictures of my face, then like, and that has become the whole wave here. All of everything has become that. And so then to see these eclipses and these Leo uh, points of tension and conflict taking place here, it looks like um, that solar picture might be getting too big to handle or something like this. We might be coming to a supernova point for that sun.
Hmm.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I've been
Yeah.
feeling like when that comes, I'm gonna lean into it like really hard. It feels like it's just something I've just been like writing in my own like personal stuff with just like all that tension. It's like I want to like lean into that strongly, just even thinking about it from the perspective of like the way I orient towards the masculine energy and how there is going to be a lot of tension there, but like somebody does have to step up and like take leadership roles in that. And you might be a lot of tension, there might be a lot of pushback, but also it's like a leader has to take that responsibility to be able to take that on with courage and pride and still keep their head high. So something
Mhm.
about that too, just it feels not necessarily fun, but it feels good,
Yeah.
you know?
I've been thinking a lot with like the hero belongs to the people, right? And so
Mm,
it's like, what is
Mm.
this? Is this rejuvenation of the solar in part like it's not about my like specific one individual expression of my identity, right? Like
yeah,
how
yeah,
can we
yeah.
be like a creator, how can we be a leader without it all being about me, right?
Right.
And it's like with my own chart, I've been dealing with those questions my whole life because I have one of these like fixed T-square signatures. And so it's like to see this coming, and it's like this like how does social media shift when it's less about like the individual creator, like what, and so thinking about, and then like this AI stuff that's coming in and all the fear around that, I feel like this is all kind of related and all part of this Pluto entering Aquarius. And this Venus in Leo will be very much about that too. And the fact that Aquarius moves back into Capricorn, it's like there's time, right? Like there's time to sort of ask these questions and move with it. Like
Mm.
we do get a
Mhm.
little bit more of that Pluto in Capricorn, um, to sort of be like, okay, so that's the project, whatever the project turns out to be. Um, mm,
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, I think it's easy to sort of get cataclysmic with and this particular day looks kind of cataclysmic. But then you know but apart from that, like, I'm sure somebody's gonna have a great day, somebody's getting married this day, and like, you know what I mean, like somebody's baby is gonna be born, it's gonna be great. But like whenever we think about the end of work as we know it because the bots are coming to take your job or whatever that sort of stuff is, um it it's unlikely that there's going to be a moment of collapse where, and like there now it's like in the movies there's a moment where everything breaks and then the internet doesn't work anymore and then the apocalypse follows that day. But
Mm,
here it's likely that like courts are going to continue to function, like you're just going to keep the grind, the hustle continues. In the inimitable words of Juicy J, the hustle continues. And so it's like, shout out North Memphis. We got North Memphis in the building right now. Um,
yeah.
so it's, like that, that timing piece that you mentioned, Palace, about it's like there's time to deal with this. There's like this little bit of Pluto that's going to happen, and we will see major things taking place here. And we've started to have eclipses, and there's, so stuff is happening for sure. And things are not going to be different, or things are not going to be the same in 2024 as they were in 2021. But there's a time that the shift is going to be slow enough that it's not like everything collapses all in the one day. We're gonna like have this moment of like having to reckon with stuff, and it's the same way as like Saturn is in Pisces now, but people don't know that the Saturn isn't working anymore. You know what I mean? Like people still think that the government or the infrastructure or whatever it is going to work the same way that it did in the fucking 80s or whatever. You know what I mean? Like this isn't aren't things working? You know what I mean? And there's going to have to be this moment of like, hold on a second. The post office used to be great. What happened? Or this kind of thing.
Yeah, one thing about the Jupiter Pluto is like Jupiter Pluto is classic like financial system, big money moving signature. Right. And so this Jupiter Pluto, just to pull that out a little bit, it's like we're working with the Jupiter Pluto conjunction was defined 2020 in part. Right. And then we had the sextile, and the sextile kind of went under the radar because it was in May of 2022 when it was Jupiter in Pisces, right? And Venus was in Pisces, and it was gorgeous. It was sextile Pluto in Capricorn, right? Like, so that was this opening, kind of this overture, like we talked about with the Jupiter Saturn cycle first. And then we're looking at this square. So this is this like opening square of the Jupiter Pluto cycle happening in 2023. And then we don't get to the opposite. So this is like 2020 until 2033 is the next Jupiter Pluto conjunction. So this is the like 13-year cycle we're currently thinking about. This is the opening square of that cycle.
That's really interesting because we can think about, so 2020, that was Jupiter in Capricorn with Pluto in Capricorn, right? And so we saw in that moment the largest upward transfer of wealth in the history of money. Since money has existed, we saw that take place at that time. And that was the conjunction. That was the new moon phase of that, right? And so this kind of speaks a little bit to what I was talking about at the beginning of this piece here, which is like, it looks like a power grab. It looks like a money grab, a land grab. You know what I mean? Like if this cycle began with plutocrats taking more power and money, then the square here, and especially with Mars as well, so Mars isn't in that opposition, then it looks like there's a pushback. It looks like there's like some kind of conflict. It looks like it doesn't, in 2020 there was a little bit of a rollover that happened, like it was like, oh, take all the money, whereas with Mars opposite, it looks like there's going to be a fight. Mars doesn't look like he's in a position to win that fight. Like being underneath the square from Jupiter and all that kind of thing. Like Mars, I don't know that the individual Mars in Leo is going to overrun the established plutocrat and Pluto in Aquarius. I don't think that is what's going to happen here, but I do feel like there's likely to be resistance to it, and that'll be an interesting nugget for us to take as we try to predict the rest of this 13-year cycle. This is going to be an extremely important moment geopolitically, macroeconomically.
I'm thinking about that, like angular Mars in the Aries ingress, and then the Saturn in the 7th, and just what we were thinking about that with, like foreign power money, the 8th house influence there too. And as it relates to war.
Super fighty.
And workers' rights too. That also fits in there as well, I think. And then Pluto moves back into Capricorn. Right after Venus makes the squares.
Stack up your territories.
Like, oh, hey, Pluto.
It's a game of Risk over here. Okay, cool. So then as we move out of all of the fixed sign stuff, then we're going to start to see Gemini season coming up in a pretty big and important way. And Gemini is interesting now because as stuff moves through Gemini, then it's going to make this square to Saturn. And so stuff in Gemini has been squaring um, Neptune in Pisces for a long time. But now we've got to add this Saturn square in here as well. And so we've got this, there's that looks like a lot. That looks like a major shift in the vibe and the dynamic there. One of the things that I think is super interesting with Gemini and Pisces is that we had, so I've got a lot of clients now who are dealing with their Saturn return, right? They're going through their Saturn return in Pisces. They're panicking. They've heard all of that, like Saturn return is going to like break your knees or something like that. And so there's a fair bit of fear around that. And so one of the things that I've been noticing as I've been doing Saturn return in Pisces readings is that like the Saturn return began before Saturn moved into Pisces because Mars was there in Gemini going forth and back and forth right on that, squaring whatever you have in Pisces. So if you've got Saturn there, then it's squaring that. And then whatever is angular to your Saturn in Pisces, like you've got something in Virgo that Saturn in Pisces is going to oppose or something like this. Like Mars already made an angular transit to that. And so it's a little bit like there's some kind of strong inflammation or irritation or wound that is open from Mars retrograde in Gemini. And then now Saturn in Pisces comes in and is like, okay, so how are we going to deal with this in the long term? It turns out, it's like a little bit the way that I've been describing Mars in Gemini is like you've got to reevaluate your plan, right? You sat down and found that there was a tack in your chair. And so that sharpness got you up out of the chair. Then you look around and you realize it wasn't a tack in the chair. It was like a piece of wiring from inside the chair is now poking up through the seat, right? And so now there's some kind of infrastructure, like you have to take this chair apart if you're going to get the sharp thing off of your ass. And so like that is kind of how I'm thinking about this Saturn in Pisces versus Mars and Gemini and how that kind of dynamic, right? And so then as we move into Gemini season of 2023, then stuff moving through Gemini, including Mars first, followed by Venus, then followed by Mercury and the Sun, is like all that stuff is going to square Saturn in Pisces. So how are y'all feeling about that situation?
Pallas.
Well, I mean, starting to see the co-presence of Saturn and Pisces will be interesting because this is like a very long story, right? It's like we get Saturn and Neptune in Pisces, and then we get Saturn and Neptune in Aries. And so just like, feeling into that a little bit, and like the fact that they're far from each other still at this point, but then to be able to witness these faster moving planets move in between the squares or oppositions to Saturn and then the squares or oppositions to Neptune feels like we'll get more of, whenever that happens, these seasons, we'll get more of a feeling for what the actual Saturn-Neptune conjunction is going to be like at the end of this transit. So that's lively in my head for sure.
Yeah, I love what you were saying about the pokey thing in the seat, Zamboni. That was beautiful. I love that. And I kind of guess I would take that and run with it and even say like the pokey thing is kind of like when things transit through Gemini, it's like the things that make us get alarmed because they're scattering us a little bit. And so with Saturn going through Pisces, I would say people need to be really mindful about like how are they mentally framing things in their life, and where is that giving them a sense of feeling like overwhelmed and alarmed about things, because it's going to take a decent amount of maturity to like calm that overwhelm that can happen when all the planets are like running through Gemini and they have a tendency to like have a lot of diversity and variety, and that diversity and variety can create issues of overwhelm with the Saturn in Pisces, especially with the people having the Saturn return. So I would say, are you being mature enough to be able to calm your sense of overwhelm with like how things are going on in life? And it would connect back to the thing we were saying about like faith with Saturn and Pisces. And so I would just say those things to begin with, because they feel really highlighted. It's like sometimes the way, especially in the time and space that we're in right now, the way that we've been taught to mentally organize things is not grounding. And it literally is like creating a sense of overwhelm. So you have to quite literally create your own structure and discipline in your life to be able to not feel overwhelmed, essentially, at this point.
That's
how
really
is your
interesting.
overwhelm?
I'm sorry, say again?
How is your overwhelm interacting with your relationships, and like how is it impacting your communication too? Feels really notable in these transits as well.
Yeah. And even like communication, not just communication too, I would say actually it's just even like thinking about Gemini as in the first intake, like going out to get information, but you like just taking it in first. And what is like, how is that creating a sense of overwhelm in your life?
Yeah. And thinking about all these things we've been talking about like truth and information and like how those help structure, but also hinder our awareness of even like national conflicts, feels potent here too. Nice.
Yeah. 1,000%. Yeah. And also if you have so many opinions, sometimes that like hinders the actual truth in general. So just being mindful when the transits go by in Gemini, just watching your opinions and seeing if they are the very thing that is causing you overwhelm. I have all these opinions about all these things going on in the world at large, and now I'm in the collective pool and I feel a sense of overwhelm. And so like being able to take a step back from that is a version of maturity, and it's not necessarily you just turning a blind eye. I see that with people, like a few people that I've worked with Saturn and Pisces. It's like they think they have to be the parent of like the collective consciousness, and it's like, well, you got to be really fucking mature to try to do something like that, and you have to really be able to like regulate your emotions and see how you're being thrown to and fro just by media in general. So that's what I would be looking for around that time. And also just like leaning into what you were saying about people starting their Saturn return.
Yeah, and wrangling one's own projections. Huge.
I think a real important thing to think with under strong mutable skies like this is internal contradiction. Especially if you're trying to be the police of the community at large or something like this, but it could be that the values that you're trying to impose onto others may contradict some of your own other values. And I've seen this a lot in political discourse where it's like the poles have sort of forgotten who is who and forgotten who they are, who they are themselves. And so that's something, and that this kind of speaks to the faith and confusion and overwhelm. All of those things feel really related to me. Like I can think about times where I drank ayahuasca, for example, and came into a like complete gnosis of the divine, which was wildly overwhelming and also deeply confusing, even though I also understood it deeply. Like the understanding and the confusion were the same thing. And so there's that, and there, it kind of makes me think about Walt Whitman's I Contain Multitudes, right? This sense of like, the internal contradiction is totally possible. And so if that internal contradiction is possible, then what does that mean for how we are going to approach boundary creation and stuff like this? Like if you are, it's almost like we can think about singularity and that kind of thing, right? This idea of like, if you come into this understanding of like all, like you have all of the knowledge of the cosmos because all of it is the one thing. And so as soon as you achieve that point, then it's almost like impossibly uncomfortable to be in that place. You need some boundaries. You need there to be some kind of separation in order to have a body and think thoughts and these kinds of things, right? And if you're going to live a life that isn't just the simple I am isness of everything, you know, which is kind of a stagnant and boring place to be. If you're going to live a life, then it's going to require some boundaries and some, you know, some borders and in order, some structure in order to navigate that. But that doesn't, just because of that, that doesn't mean that it's all going to be internally consistent and these kinds of things. And so the I feel like, you know, Gemini and Virgo, for example, those are, I think of those as being like the information signs, you know, with being Mercury ruled and this kind of stuff. And they've been having a rough time with this Neptune in Pisces opposite to Virgo and square to Gemini for this whole time, right? And then we add Saturn to that. And it's just like no information makes any type of sense. And so, what I would love to see from the collective, I don't necessarily think this is going to happen, but what I would love to see is people getting into a place. This gets back to the soup, right? Like getting into a place where we can be comfortable with a kind of contradiction. It's like being comfortable with disagreement and this kind of thing. Like if there is some kind of contradiction, then it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not part of the soup.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
An essential part of the soup.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
That vinyl chloride really brings it together, you know?
I don't make pop culture references that much because I'm not, I don't know, whatever. I'm not really that person. But with when Saturn moved into Capricorn, I was thinking a lot about like Wall-E, and like Wall-E being this little robot who's like picks through the garbage of devastation, and thinking about like Saturn and Capricorn coming up and cleaning up after Pluto and Capricorn, right? And so it's like I'm sort of trying to come up with a similar one that's like Saturn now in Pisces, like cleaning up what Neptune in Pisces has wrought. Won't be quite as organized as Saturn in Capricorn, but there's some way, and there is like a cleansing action to Saturn in Pisces, maybe.
You
right?
think it's
like,
cleansing? Saturn is generally associated with dirty,
be.
Smelly, gross things.
Yeah, but I also like often I'll refer to one of my oldest analogies for Saturn is like a sieve, right? And so it's like you pour things through Saturn. I sort of use this analogy in like Saturn return. It's like you're kind of get poured through this sieve, and like what is necessary remains. So I'm like, I'm trying with that one. I haven't figured it out yet, but I'm trying a little bit, because as someone with Virgo placements, Neptune in Pisces has been amazing in a lot of ways, right? Like the spiritualizing capacity of Neptune is incredible. But yeah, there's also like a real like wrangling with addiction stuff, right? And it's like Saturn has been necessary to wrangling with those processes. And so it's like, what does Saturn in Pisces do? Certainly challenge the mechanisms, like the control mechanisms and defense mechanisms and coping, but it's got to also bring some kind of gift to the Neptune processes.
Yeah.
Sure. Well, I mean, heroin does give us Charlie
Absolutely.
Parker, right?
Yeah.
I think Saturn too could just bring work there. You know, it's like Pisces being like a very poetic, mystical sign, and you bring Saturn in there, and Saturn might be dissolving, but it still can bring structure in order to create a sense of disillusion in and of itself. And I think that's something that I would invite people to like reach for. Like, when was the last time you did just take like a day and just do spiritual practices all day? Because that's work. And a lot of times the way that shows up in the world is like you seem like you're lazy, or you're doing nothing, or you're just meandering. But it could be like some of the greatest work you do in your life, to be able to access something that's like kind of more transcendent, or to be able to work towards allowing the creative intelligence of the universe to flow through you. That like people say that like it's some flippant thing, but like a lot of people do work to make that happen. And it's not something that's just necessarily easy to do. And so, yeah, there's always something there with Saturn coming through. And even if Saturn is making things smell bad, then now we know that we have a responsibility to take the shit out and clean it. So even if it's showing up in that way, then it still can be productive.
I love it.
What
yeah,
you
like
said
Saturn.
there. Oh yeah, hit it.
No, go.
Well, what you said there made me think about something that Veda Austin said one time. Veda Austin is an indigenous, I think, Maori person from like Oceania or Polynesia or something like this. And so she's from an indigenous island people, and so they think a lot about water, and so she's got this water lineage, and she studies water all the time, and so she talks about water as holding space, and the capacity of water to be memory, like that's what it does, is it like stores information. And after I heard her say that, then I like kind of went down a rabbit hole and tried to figure out what information was. It's not easy to know now that I have done that. Information is that which gives form to, which is no real information. But so this idea, and then so one of the things that I heard her say this on the Emergence podcast. Super shout out to the Emergence podcast with Ayana Young. That shit is dope. You should check it out. You should stop listening to me and go listen to her. But one of the things that she said there was that she really respects the tap water so much because it holds all of the shit. And this sense of like holding space and memory of like excrement and that which is, you know, smelly and all the rest of it that you like try to get rid of, that you flush away, you know, the water remembers it. And there's something really deep and important there that I haven't figured out yet, that it might take me 2.5-3 years of Saturn in Pisces to really feel into. And I'm probably not going to take a bath in the toilet anytime soon, but there will be, you know, it seems like that's something that's there's something visceral there that I think is worth exploring.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah. And also I think on some level too, when we think of transcendence, it becomes like that contradiction, but really the energetic signature behind things is the structure of them. And I think that's something that we like oftentimes like really we forget it, and we forget it so much that we start to act like these things don't make sense, right? Like the water in my body right now, I can literally change it. You know, when people like say change your vibe, it's like, what the fuck does that mean? You know, a lot of people think like, what does that even mean? But I have the discipline, and also Saturn does represent like this like wisdom that comes from like ancient times. And so I could literally just sit here and just say, and the water's already changing. It's already happening. That doesn't seem practical to people. It doesn't seem concrete to people. But also sometimes that's our lack of understanding and our disconnection from the source that flows through everything. And to me, I'm like, that's practical. And that's something that I would love to see in this time. It's like the mystical things and like the scientific things coming together to be able to like, actually, this is just this thing. It's not even woo-woo. It's just what reality actually is beyond what you can see with your eyes. So, yeah.
Or maybe it is, but we just live in a time of heresy. So, like, woo it the fuck up, you know?
Yeah. I always said, like, it's like, I just feel like the woo is just true. And so I don't have to make it a cosmic thing because I'm cosmic and everything's cosmic, but I don't have to like use it in like rainbow and cupcake language. Also, I guess he plants in Capricorn, so it's like whatever. I'm just fucking Saturnian, so.
Okay, so how about so Neptune in Pisces, we know that it's associated with like this rise in popularity of astrology and mysticism generally. So it's like Saturn and Pisces coming in and like normalizing that shit.
Yeah,
That's pretty
absolutely.
good.
Absolutely. Yeah, no doubt about it.
I don't know how I feel about that.
Complicated. Complicated.
Yeah. And I do think people are trying to make like even the ideas that seem like they were difficult to grasp more concrete. Like that is happening.
Totally.
I feel a little bit like Shrek. Like, yo, get the fuck out of my swamp. I moved out here because you weren't here. What the hell?
And what
Try to make
about
this
what
into the
about
suburbs?
so yeah, no, I hear that. I'm curious around too though. It's like what about the fact that it's becoming popular, people coming to your swamp, then you can like show them the greatness of the swamp in and of itself, you know? It's like 30 years ago, would anybody have come to the swamp and what have you been doing out there in the swamp by yourself? And so now people are coming to the swamp and that sucks, but at the same time, it's like it does have something there that you can present to them and show them in the swamp.
People are moving to the beach.
Indeed. I like your optimistic vision of the future here. Well, I do want to be cognizant. Say again?
It's just all Saturnian work to me. So yeah, I feel you.
Work. Thank you all so much for being here. We are a little bit out of time. I want to be cognizant of all of the other things that we have going on here in the world, in our lives, which may or may not be cosmic and or quotidian. I do want to send a shout out to you. What you guys got going on, Pallas? What's up with you? Are you back on? Are you working again?
I finally have things to announce.
Love it.
So,
tell us about it.
So March 22nd is the first collection release of Idola Stellarum, which is my partner and I's astrological talisman collection release, temple, library, business, whatever. So March 22nd. So that's idolastellarum.com, IDOLA stellar. I'll figure out a better way to say that in the future. So .com. So you can get on the mailing list and the collection goes to the mailing list on the 22nd. So that's super exciting. And then also I have a wait list open for Spiral, which is going to be a membership for consulting astrologers. It's primarily going to be based on my kind of transit cycle approach, but there'll be sort of like a mentorship component to it because I've done so much research with case studies with the IC book that we'll be working on that a little bit too with people. So it's a bit emergent. So if people are interested in what I do and how I do it and have maybe wanted to get a session with me, but haven't been able to access it, and they're a consulting astrologer who's working with their own clients, this is like a really good accessible way to, just interface with me on like a closer level. So the wait list is there. You can go to my website, nineofwands.com, and that'll be the way we do that.
Yeah. Amazing. That sounds like such a great opportunity. So I can't wait to. I'm probably gonna get on the wait list my damn self. Cameron, what you got going on?
Well, right now I'm currently making like a transition to working back more with the people in the city for this quarter specifically. But I am working with more people as far as like taking their astrological practice and then like sinking it into a more embodied experience. So mentorship program. I'm gonna be coming out with that in the next few weeks or to a month. And it's gonna be like helping people transition from just evolutionary astrology to more traditional or traditional to evolutionary or either and or whatever, or medical astrology, but like synthesizing all those things in a way where you can see clearly, not only from an astrological lens, but see life in reality clearly as well. And like really find ways to become medicine to people in the most simple, practical ways. So also, from the perspective of if you're working with evolutionary astrology or traditional astrology, and you want to start giving remedies to people, like I put people through like a little 6-month program to where they can offer things to people. And it's like, you're not going to conflict with any of their doctors or anything like that. It's super simple, but super clear and very immediately applicable. So I'm working on that right now too. So those are the main things that I'm working on. maybe in a quarter or so. We'll talk about that later. We'll do that later. Yeah. So that's what I got going
in a
on
quarter.
right
We'll
now.
be here again.
Totally, exactly. So that's what I got going on right now. I think that's it. Oh, NORAC's coming up this quarter, right?
Oh yeah. That's
So
right.
yeah, NORAC. I'm gonna be speaking twice at NORAC. And I think that's it. Yeah.
Word. That sounds those sort of bringing those two disparate things and like putting them together. That sounds like real Saturn and Pisces business there. So right on time as always. If the folks are interested in the things that I do, I have a breath exercise that is available on Spotify, Tidal, Pandora, Bandcamp, etc., etc. I also have music that is good for just listening. It's called Can't Help Myself. Please check that out. Honestly, I want you to do that more than I want you to get an astrology reading with me, because I'm so fucking proud of this music. I've worked so damn hard on it, and it's the thing that I care about most in this life. So go check out the music. There's probably music playing under my voice right now. I also made that music. There's next music coming out I hope in the next month or so. Who even knows in this lifetime? But you can check all that out. If you want to send me a tip via Venmo, Cash App, PayPal, I always super appreciate y'all for being here. I want to give thanks, as always, to the ancestors. Give thanks to the descendants for coming after us and taking whatever we give to them. Thank you so much for doing that. We give thanks to the ancestors of this place, to the turtle that underlies all of the land and that holds all of us up. We give thanks to the waters, which hold the memories, which continue to give us life, though we may not deserve it. We give thanks unto the one most high creator, Jah Rastafari. Thank you all so much for being here. I look forward to seeing y'all next time. Bye.